Billionaire CEO Arthur Pendleton didn't just divorce his wife of 12 years. He erased her. Dismissing Catherine as plain furniture in his grand life, he replaced her with a model half her age. Arthur believed he had won, burying the past to chase the spotlight. But tonight, beneath the chandeliers of New York's most ruthless social event, he faces a terrifying lesson. Truly dangerous women don't scream. They transform. You won't believe who steps out of that limousine, and you certainly won't believe what she's holding. It isn't a clutch. It's his destruction. Arthur is about to lose absolutely everything. The mirror in the penthouse suite of the Pierre Hotel didn't lie, and Arthur Pendleton liked it that way. At 48, he was still a specimen of American corporate royalty, silver at the temples, jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and a tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars. He adjusted his bow tie, watching his own reflection with the satisfaction of a man who owned the world. "Arthur, baby, does this diamond choker look too aggressive?" The voice drifted from the walk-in closet, high-pitched and demanding. Jessica Vane stepped out, twirling in a dress that was less of a garment and more of a crimson scream for attention. She was 24, a former swimsuit model, with a laugh that sounded like champagne bubbles, and a brain that Arthur privately considered to be mostly decorative. "It's perfect, Jess," Arthur said, barely turning around. "You look expensive, that's the point." "I just want them to see us and die," she giggled, pressing a kiss to his cheek, leaving a faint smear of lip gloss he'd have to wipe off later. "Especially the old guard. They still look at me like I'm the help." "Let them look," Arthur said, checking his Rolex. "Tonight isn't about them. It's about the merger. Once I announce the acquisition of the Kincaid Tech Group, Pendleton Logistics becomes the largest shipping conglomerate on the eastern seaboard. I'll be untouchable." He checked his phone. No messages. Good. But as he looked at his reflection again, a memory, uninvited and unwanted, clawed its way up. 2 years ago. The day he ended it. He remembered the kitchen in their old estate in Connecticut. It was raining. Catherine was sitting at the island, wearing that grey cardigan she always wore, checking the household budget. No makeup. Hair in a messy bun. She looked comfortable, and it made him sick. "I need a divorce, Catherine," he had said, casually, as if ordering coffee. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown the vase of hydrangeas at him. She just looked up, her hazel eyes confused behind her reading glasses. "Is this about Jessica?" "It's about me," Arthur had sneered, leaning in. "It's about the fact that I walk into rooms and command attention, and you blend into the wallpaper. You're plain, Catherine. You're safe, and I'm tired of being safe. I need a queen, not a housekeeper." He remembered the silence that followed. It wasn't the silence of sadness. It was a strange, vacuum-like silence. She had closed the budget ledger, stood up, and removed her wedding ring. She placed it on the granite counter with a soft click. "You're right, Arthur," she had whispered. "I have been blending in. Thank you for waking me up." She walked out with nothing but her purse. He hadn't seen her since. He heard she moved to Europe. Zurich or Milan, maybe? He didn't care. He sent the alimony checks to a lawyer, and they were always cashed. That was the extent of Catherine Holloway's existence in his world. "Earth to Arthur," Jessica snapped her fingers. "The limo is downstairs. It's showtime." Arthur shook his head, dispelling the grey image of his ex-wife. He looked at Jessica, vibrant, loud, undeniable. "Right?" Arthur smiled, the shark-like grin returning. "Let's go show them what winning looks like." The Aurora Foundation Gala was not just a party, it was a battlefield. Held annually at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, It was the night where New York's elite came to measure their net worth against their neighbors. The air smelled of expensive perfume, orchids, and desperation. Camera flashes erupted like lightning storms as Arthur and Jessica stepped onto the red carpet. Jessica posed with practiced ease, jutting her hip, tossing her hair. Arthur stood stoic, one hand in his pocket, the other lightly touching the small of her back, a gesture of ownership. "Mr. Pendleton, Mr. Pendleton, is the Kincaid deal finalized?" A reporter from the Wall Street Journal shouted. Arthur gave a tight, mysterious smile. "Tonight is about charity, gentlemen. Business happens in the boardroom." He winked. He loved this. He loved the hunger in their eyes. Inside, the great hall was transformed into a winter wonderland of white roses and ice sculptures. Waiters moved like ghosts with trays of caviar. Arthur navigated the room, Jessica clinging to his arm like a trophy. "Arthur, you old pirate," boomed a voice. It was Silas Thorne, the CEO of a rival banking firm. Silas was a heavy man with eyes that missed nothing. "I see you brought companionship." Silas glanced at Jessica with a thinly veiled sneer. "Jessica, this is Silas," Arthur said smoothly. "Silas, behave." "Lovely to meet you," Jessica chirped. "I love your tie. It's so vintage." Silas blinked, then turned his back on her, focusing entirely on Arthur. "Word on the street is you're over-leveraged, Arthur. The Kincaid deal is costing you everything. If the board finds out you dipped into the pension reserves..." Arthur's smile didn't falter, but his pulse spiked. "Rumors, Silas. Jealousy is an ugly cologne. You shouldn't wear so much of it." "Just be careful," Silas murmured, leaning in, his voice dropping to a growl. "I heard Kincaid has a silent partner. Someone new. Someone who bought 40% of the voting shares last week." Arthur froze. "That's impossible. Kincaid is a family-run operation." "Not anymore. Check your sources." Silas patted Arthur's shoulder and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Arthur felt a cold bead of sweat roll down his spine. A silent partner? 40%? That would give them veto power over the acquisition. If the deal fell through, Pendleton Logistics would implode under the debt he'd secretly accrued to finance it. "He was rude," Jessica pouted, grabbing a flute of champagne. "Why is everyone so uptight tonight?" "Quiet, Jess," Arthur snapped, scanning the room. He needed to find Thomas Kincaid. He needed answers. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a ripple of silence starting near the massive bronze doors of the entrance and spreading inward like a wave. The chatter died down, the clinking of glasses stopped, even the string quartet faltered for a beat. "What's going on?" Jessica stood on her tiptoes. "Is it a celebrity? Is it Beyoncé?" Arthur frowned, looking toward the entrance. The crowd was parting. Not just parting, they were stepping back in genuine awe. The heavy doors swung open. First, there was the dress. It was midnight blue velvet, structured and strapless, hugging a silhouette that was statuesque and commanding. It had a slit that ran dangerously high, revealing a leg that looked like it had been sculpted from marble. Then, the jewels. Around her neck wasn't a gaudy diamond choker like Jessica's. It was a necklace of sapphires and white gold, a piece that Arthur recognized instantly. It was the Romanov star. It had been auctioned at Sotheby's 3 months ago for $6 million. The buyer had been anonymous. And then, the face. Arthur squinted. The woman walked with a slow, predatory grace. Her hair, once a mousy brown mess, usually tied up in a clip, was now a cascading river of honey-blonde waves that caught the light with every step. Her face was highlighted to perfection, cheekbones sharp enough to cut, lips painted a deep, dangerous oxblood red. She looked like a goddess of war. She looked like a supermodel who owned the building. She looked familiar. The woman stopped at the top of the stairs overlooking the great hall. She surveyed the room with eyes that were no longer confused or soft. They were cold, calculating. A hush fell over the entire gala. "Who is that?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling with sudden insecurity. "She's stunning." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. His knees went weak. The glass of scotch in his hand tilted, spilling amber liquid onto his tuxedo trousers, but he didn't notice. He knew that walk. He knew the slight tilt of her chin when she was assessing a threat. "My God," Arthur whispered. It was Catherine. But it wasn't the Catherine he had discarded. This wasn't the woman who clipped coupons and worried about the electricity bill. This was a woman who looked like she could buy Arthur's life and sell it for scraps without blinking. Beside her, a man stepped forward to offer his arm. Arthur's stomach turned over. It was Dominic Russo. Dominic Russo was the one man Arthur feared. A venture capitalist from Italy, known as the Butcher of Milan, for how ruthlessly he dismantled failing companies. He was 10 years younger than Arthur, taller, and possessed a darkness that Arthur had always tried to imitate, but never mastered. Catherine took Dominic's arm, but she didn't cling to him like Jessica clung to Arthur. She rested her hand there lightly. They were equals, partners. They began to descend the stairs. The sound of Catherine's heels clicking on the marble echoed in the silent hall. Click, 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 like a countdown. "That can't be her," Arthur muttered, shaking his head. "That's impossible." "You know her?" Jessica asked, eyes wide. "That," Arthur choked out, his throat dry as sandpaper, "is my ex-wife." Jessica gasped. "The plain one? The furniture?" Catherine reached the bottom of the stairs. The crowd, usually so eager to judge, seemed paralyzed. She began to move through them, and people scrambled to get out of her way, murmuring greetings that sounded more like prayers. She was heading straight for him. Arthur wanted to run. He wanted to hide behind the ice sculpture. But his feet were lead. Catherine stopped 3 feet away from him. Up close, the transformation was even more terrifying. Her skin was luminous. She smelled of jasmine and something darker, oud perhaps. Money. She smelled like old money. She looked at Arthur. Then she looked at Jessica, her gaze raking over the crimson dress for exactly 1 second before dismissing her entirely. "Hello, Arthur," she said. Her voice was lower than he remembered. Smokier. "Catherine?" Arthur managed to squeak. You look different?" she finished for him, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "I suppose I do. It's amazing what happens when you drop 200 pounds of dead weight." The people nearby, Silas Thorne included, snickered. Jessica bristled, sensing the insult. "Excuse me. I'm Jessica, Arthur's fiancée." She thrust her hand out, the diamond ring Arthur had bought her flashing aggressively. Catherine didn't take the hand. She just looked at the ring. "I know who you are, dear." Cute ring. Arthur always did have a thing for buying things he couldn't afford to keep. Jessica's mouth fell open. Save it," Catherine said softly, turning her eyes back to Arthur. The playfulness vanished. "I'm not here for social hour, Arthur. I'm here for business." "Business?" Arthur laughed nervously, trying to regain his footing. "Cat, be serious. What business could you possibly have here? The silent auction is over by the bar." Dominic Russo stepped forward, his presence looming over Arthur. "She's not here for the auction, Pendleton," Dominic said, his Italian accent thick and smooth. "Then what?" Arthur sneered, trying to puff out his chest. Catherine took a step closer, invading his personal space. Did you hear about the Kincaid merger, Arthur? The silent partner. The one who bought the 40% voting bloc. Arthur stopped breathing. Yes. What of it? Catherine tilted her head. You're looking at her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. You, Arthur whispered. You bought Kincaid. With what money? You had nothing. I had half of your assets, Arthur, she reminded him. And unlike you, I didn't spend it on Ferraris and plastic surgery for my mistresses. I invested. And Dominic, she glanced at the Italian. He taught me how to hunt. She leaned in close to his ear, her lips brushing his skin, sending a shiver of pure terror through him. I'm the majority shareholder now, Arthur. And I've seen your books. I know about the debt. I know about the pension fund. She pulled back, her eyes hard as diamonds. Enjoy the party. It's likely the last one you'll ever attend as a CEO. The transition from the cocktail reception to the seated dinner was a blur for Arthur. Usually, this was his favorite part of the night, the moment the herd was thinned and the power players took their assigned seats at the tables near the stage. The seating chart at the Aurora Gala was a rigid hierarchy. The closer you were to the podium, the more you mattered. Arthur walked toward table 1, the platinum circle, his hand gripping Jessica's arm tight enough to bruise. He needed to sit down. He needed water. He needed to wake up from this nightmare. Arthur, you're hurting me, Jessica hissed, trying to pry his fingers off. Smile, Arthur commanded through gritted teeth. Just smile. They reached table 1. Arthur expected to see the usual suspects. The mayor, the CEO of the hospital, maybe a senator. Instead, he saw a place card that made his blood run cold. Catherine Holloway Rousseau. It was right next to his. And next to her sat Thomas Kincaid, the man Arthur was supposed to be acquiring. They were laughing. Catherine was leaning in, touching Thomas's forearm lightly, a gesture of familiarity that Arthur had never seen her use with anyone but him. Well, this is cozy, Catherine said, as Arthur approached, her voice smooth as silk. She didn't stand up. She gestured to the empty chair beside her. Sit, Arthur. You look like you're about to faint. Arthur collapsed into the chair. Jessica sat on his other side, eyeing Catherine with a mixture of jealousy and confusion. So, Jessica started, trying to stake her territory, picking up a bread roll. You're the ex-wife. Arthur told me you were older. The table went silent. Thomas Kincaid choked on his water. Dominic Rousseau, sitting across from them, just smirked, cutting his steak with surgical precision. Catherine turned to Jessica, her expression pitying. And Arthur told me he was looking for an intellectual equal. I suppose we were both lied to. She turned her back on Jessica before the girl could respond, focusing entirely on Thomas Kincaid. Thomas, Catherine said, ignoring Arthur completely. I was looking at the R&D projections for the new logistics software. If we cut the redundancy in the shipping lanes, we can increase margins by 12% in Q3. Dominic agrees. Absolutely, Thomas nodded enthusiastically. I've been trying to tell Arthur that for 6 months, but he was too busy restructuring our marketing department. Marketing is crucial, Arthur snapped, his voice too loud. Perception is reality, Thomas. Perception doesn't pay the dividends, Arthur, Catherine said without looking at him. She took a sip of her red wine, a vintage screamingly expensive, likely brought from Dominic's private cellar. Cash flow pays dividends, solvency pays dividends, not stealing from Peter to pay Paul. Arthur froze. She knew. He leaned in, dropping his voice to a menacing whisper. What are you playing at, Cat? You don't know the first thing about corporate finance. You're a housewife. You organized bake sales. Catherine finally turned to him. Her eyes were terrifyingly void of the love he used to see there. "I organized your life, Arthur. I managed your schedule, your diet, your family, your image. I made you palatable to the public because, left to your own devices, you're an abrasive narcissist. And while you were out, working late," she glanced pointedly at Jessica, "I was reading. I was learning. And when I left, I took my half of the settlement, and I didn't buy shoes. I bought leverage." She signaled the waiter. "More wine for Mr. Pendleton. He's going to need it." "You can't stop the merger," Arthur hissed. "I have the board in my pocket." "Do you?" Catherine asked lightly. "Look at table 3. Arthur turned. Table 3 was where his board of directors sat. Usually, they would be waving at him, raising glasses. Tonight, they were huddled together, heads down, looking at their phones. One of them, Bill Henderson, looked up, met Arthur's eyes, and immediately looked away, his face pale. "What did you do?" Arthur demanded, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I didn't do anything," Catherine said, buttering a roll. "I just sent them an email, a simplified audit of the Pendleton Logistics Pension Fund. You know, the fund that's supposed to have $40 million in it. The one you raided to pay for the down payment on the Kincaid acquisition because no bank would lend to you?" Jessica laughed nervously. "Arthur, what is she talking about? What's a pension fund?" Arthur felt the room spinning. That's privileged information. That's corporate espionage." "It's whistleblowing, Arthur," Dominic Russo interjected, his voice deep and gravelly. "And in this country, it's protected. Especially when the one blowing the whistle owns 40% of the company you're trying to defraud." "I'm not defrauding anyone," Arthur cried out. A few heads at nearby tables turned. "I was going to pay it back. Once the merger went through, the stock price would jump, and I'd put the money back before anyone noticed." "Ah," Catherine smiled. "The classic Ponzi logic. I'll put it back before they notice. It works until it doesn't." The lights in the ballroom dimmed. The spotlight hit the stage. The CEO of the Aurora Foundation walked to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man of the hour, the visionary behind tonight's largest donation pledge, Mr. Arthur Pendleton." Applause broke out. It was polite, scattered. Arthur stood up. This was it. He had to bluff. If he could get up there, make the speech, and pledge $1 million to the charity, he could prove he was liquid. He could calm the board down. He could survive the night. He adjusted his jacket. "Watch me," he sneered at Catherine. "I always win." "Go ahead, Arthur," Catherine whispered, raising her glass. "Break a leg." Arthur walked to the stage. The walk felt miles long. The spotlight was blinding, hot against his skin. He could feel the sweat beading at his hairline. He stepped up to the podium, gripping the sides to steady his trembling hands. "Thank you," Arthur said, his voice booming through the speakers. He flashed his signature smile, the one that had graced the cover of Forbes. Tonight is about giving back. It's about legacy. He paused for effect. Usually, this was where the room leaned in. Tonight, he could see people whispering. He saw Silas Thorne showing something on his phone to the woman next to him. "I am proud," Arthur continued, his voice wavering slightly, "to announce that Pendleton Logistics is stronger than ever. And to prove our commitment to the future, I am pledging $1 million to the Aurora Arts Initiative." There was a gasp. $1 million. It was a massive sum. "Furthermore," Arthur pushed on, desperate to regain control, "I am thrilled to announce the successful acquisition of Kincaid Tech. As of tomorrow morning, we will be one family." Objection. The word wasn't shouted. It was spoken into a microphone, clear and calm, cutting through the room like a knife. Arthur froze. At table 1, Catherine was standing. She had a handheld microphone. Where had she gotten that? Had she planned this down to the audio tech? "I'm afraid that's not quite accurate, Arthur," Catherine said. She wasn't looking at him. She was addressing the room. She looked regal, the sapphire Romanov star glittering at her throat. "Sit down, Catherine," Arthur shouted into the podium mic, losing his composure. "Security, remove her. She's drunk." "I'm perfectly sober, Arthur," she replied. "And I think the shareholders present tonight deserve the truth before the market opens tomorrow." She gestured to the large projection screen behind Arthur, the one meant to display the charity's logo. Suddenly, the image flickered. The Aurora logo vanished. In its place appeared a spreadsheet. It was complex, filled with red ink, but the header was unmistakable. Pendleton Logistics, Internal Audit, Restricted. A murmur ripped through the crowd. "What is that?" someone shouted. "That," Catherine said, walking slowly toward the stage, Dominic flanking her like a bodyguard, "is the balance sheet Arthur doesn't want you to see. It shows that Pendleton Logistics is technically insolvent. The assets he claims to have, leveraged 3 times over, and the cash for the Kincaid merger, stolen from the employee retirement accounts. Lies!" Arthur screamed, his face turning purple. "Turn it off! Cut the feed!" He waved frantically at the tech booth, but the technicians didn't move. Dominic had likely paid them off too, or perhaps they just wanted to see the train wreck. "Arthur," Catherine continued, stopping at the foot of the stage. She looked up at him. "You don't have $1 million to pledge. You don't even have the money to pay for that tuxedo. It's on the company credit card, which I froze 20 minutes ago." Arthur's hand flew to his pocket. He pulled out his phone. Alert. Card declined. Alert. Bank accounts frozen, pending SEC investigation. The notifications were stacking up on his screen. The room was in chaos now. Reporters were running toward the stage, phones recording. Silas Thorne was laughing openly. The board of directors at table 3 were actively leaving the room, trying to distance themselves from the fallout. Jessica Vane stood up at the table. She looked at the screen, then at Arthur, then at the furious crowd. "Arthur!" she shrieked. "Is this true? Is my credit card frozen too?" "Shut up, Jessica!" Arthur roared. That was the final nail. The room turned on him. The veneer of the charming billionaire cracked, revealing the desperate, angry man beneath. Catherine walked up the stairs of the stage. She didn't take the podium from him. She simply stood next to him. She was taller in her heels, more imposing. "I tried to warn you," she said, her voice audible only to him now, away from the mic. "I told you I was tired of being safe." "Why?" Arthur wept, the fight draining out of him as he looked at the ruined crowd. "Why are you doing this? I gave you everything." "You gave me nothing, Arthur," she corrected him. "You took 12 years of my life and threw me away because I wasn't shiny enough. You wanted a trophy? Well, congratulations." She gestured to the crowd, to the cameras flashing, capturing his ruin in high definition. "You're finally the center of attention. Isn't that what you always wanted?" Catherine turned to the microphone one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Kincaid Tech, I would like to announce that the merger with Pendleton Logistics is officially cancelled due to lack of funds. However, Kincaid Tech will be making the $1 million donation in honor of the Pendleton employees who deserve better." The room erupted in applause, not for Arthur, but for her. Arthur stood there, alone in the spotlight, while the woman he called plain shone brighter than anything he had ever owned. But the night wasn't over. As Arthur watched his empire crumble on the screen behind him, he saw two men in dark suits entering the back of the ballroom. They weren't waiters. They weren't guests. They were wearing windbreakers with 3 yellow letters on the back. FBI. Catherine saw them too. She leaned in one last time. Checkmate, Arthur. The arrival of the FBI was not the cinematic explosion Arthur might have expected from the movies. There were no sirens wailing in the distance, no SWAT teams rappelling from the ceiling, no shouted commands to get down. It was far more terrifying than that. It was quiet, it was bureaucratic, and it was utterly, chillingly inescapable. The massive men stepped inside. They were not wearing men stepped inside. They were not wearing tuxedos. They were dressed in ill-fitting polyester suits in shades of charcoal and navy, windbreakers pulled tight over bulletproof vests that bulked their frames. On the back of their jackets, bright yellow letters screamed an acronym that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. FBI. The string quartet, which had been attempting to play a nervous rendition of Vivaldi to cover the awkwardness of Arthur's public meltdown, screeched to a halt. A bow dropped onto the marble floor with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot. Agent Miller led the phalanx. He was a man with a face like a crumpled paper bag, weather-beaten, tired, and completely unimpressed by the display of wealth around him. He walked with a heavy, purposeful gait, his cheap rubber-soled shoes squeaking faintly on the polished floor. He ignored the waiters freezing with trays of champagne. He ignored the billionaires clutching their pearls. His eyes were locked on one target, the man sweating under the spotlight on the stage. Arthur watched them approach. The distance from the doors to the stage was perhaps 50 yards, but to Arthur it felt like watching a slow-motion execution. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird trying to break free of his chest. "No," Arthur whispered, the microphone picking up the tremble in his breath. "This isn't happening. This is a mistake." He looked at the crowd, desperate for an ally. "Someone do something. This is a private event. They can't just walk in here." No one moved. The elite of New York, people Arthur had dined with, played golf with, and vacationed with, stood like statues. They were predators, all of them, and they knew the scent of blood. Arthur wasn't one of them anymore. He was prey. Agent Miller reached the stairs of the stage. He didn't run, he trudged, radiating the weary authority of a man who had arrested 100 men like Arthur and would arrest 100 more. He stepped up to the podium, flanked by 2 other agents who secured the perimeter of the stage, hands resting hovering near their holsters. "Arthur Pendleton?" Agent Miller asked, his voice flat and bored, though he clearly knew exactly who stood before him. Arthur took a stumbling step back, nearly tripping over the microphone stand. "You're making a mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high, undignified pitch. "Do you know who I am? I am the CEO of Pendleton Logistics. I have dinner with the governor. I just pledged $1 million to charity." Agent Miller didn't even blink. He reached behind his back and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. They glinted ominously under the harsh stage lights. "The governor isn't going to help you with wire fraud, embezzlement of protected pension funds, and gross securities manipulation, Mr. Pendleton," Agent Miller said, stepping into Arthur's personal space. The agent smelled of stale coffee and rain, the smell of the real world invading Arthur's perfumed bubble. "I have rights!" Arthur shrieked, backing away until he bumped into the projection screen still displaying his ruined balance sheet. "I want my lawyer. You can't arrest me without a warrant." "We have the warrant," Miller said calmly, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket and holding it up. "Signed by a federal judge 20 minutes ago, and thanks to an anonymous tip regarding the shredding of subpoenaed documents scheduled for 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, We have probable cause to take you into custody immediately to prevent flight." Flight risk. The words hung in the air. Arthur's head snapped toward Catherine. She was standing near the edge of the stage, still as a lake, with Dominic Rousseau standing like a dark sentinel beside her. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look angry. She looked efficient, like she was checking off the final item on a very long to-do list. "You called them," Arthur whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "I did," Catherine replied. Her voice projected clearly through the silence without the need for a microphone. "You were planning to fly to the Cayman Islands tomorrow morning after the merger papers were signed, weren't you, Arthur? The flight plan for your Gulf Stream was filed 3 hours ago. You labeled the trip vacation." Arthur's knees buckled. The room spun. She knew. She knew about the jet. She knew about the accounts. She had been inside his life, a ghost in the machine, watching every move he made while he was too busy looking at his own reflection to notice. "Turn around, please," Agent Miller instructed, grabbing Arthur's shoulder with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Arthur tried to pull away, but it was useless. He was spun around roughly. His arms were wrenched behind his back. The cold, biting metal of the handcuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists. Click, click. The sound echoed through the ballroom, amplified by the acoustics of the museum. A collective gasp went through the room. The king of logistics, the man on the cover of magazines, was being chained like a common criminal in front of 500 witnesses. Panic, hot and blinding, surged through Arthur's brain. "At the precinct! Tell him to bring the... At the precinct! Tell him to bring the bail money!" He found her. Jessica Vane was standing by table 1. But she wasn't reaching for her phone. She wasn't crying. She wasn't rushing the stage to defend her fiancé. She was reaching for her clutch. Jessica stood up slowly, smoothing down the crimson fabric of her dress. She looked up at Arthur, really looked at him, for the first time that night. Her eyes, usually wide with feigned adoration, were now narrow and calculating. She looked at the handcuffs. She looked at the FBI agents. And then she looked at the projection screen that showed Arthur was broke. "Jessica," Arthur pleaded, tears streaming down his face, ruining his tan. "Baby, I need you." Jessica let out a sigh, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. A sigh of inconvenience, like she had broken a nail. She opened her designer clutch, pulled out the 10-carat diamond engagement ring that had cost Arthur $250,000, and held it up to the ballroom lights. "Is this fake too, Arthur?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air, icy and sharp. "What?" "No," Arthur babbled, desperation clawing at his throat. "It's real. It's VVS1 clarity, I swear. Jessica, please don't do this. I love you." "You need a lawyer, Arthur," Jessica said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "And if all your accounts are frozen, you can't afford me anymore." She opened her hand. She didn't hand the ring to him. She didn't place it on the table. She simply let gravity take it. The massive diamond hit the marble floor with a sharp clack, bounced once, and rolled unceremoniously under the table, coming to rest near a discarded napkin. Then Jessica turned to the man sitting next to her, Silas Thorne. Silas, Arthur's oldest rival, the man who had been waiting for Arthur's downfall for a decade, stood up. He was 60, overweight and balding, but tonight he looked like a winner. "Silas," Jessica poured, her voice shifting instantly back to the bubbly, flirtatious tone that Arthur had once thought was reserved for him. She placed a hand on Silas's chest. "You mentioned earlier you have a house in the Hamptons. It must be dreadfully lonely this time of year with all that space." Silas Thorne grinned, a shark sensing a fresh meal. He stepped over the spot where Arthur's engagement ring lay gathering dust. He offered Jessica his arm. "It can be, my dear," Silas rumbled, his eyes twinkling with malice as he looked up at Arthur on the stage. "Why don't we go? Discuss the interior design. My driver is outside." "No!" Arthur screamed, straining against the agent's grip. "Jessica! He's old! He's fat! He's my enemy! Jessica!" She didn't even look back. She took Silas's arm, flipped her hair over her shoulder, and walked out of the ballroom, stepping over the ruins of Arthur's life without breaking stride. "Let's go, Mr. Pendleton," Agent Miller said, shoving Arthur forward. The walk from the stage to the exit was a gauntlet of humiliation. As the agents marched him down the center aisle, the crowd didn't look away. They didn't offer sympathy. They pulled out their phones. Hundreds of screens lit up, recording every second of his disgrace. Flashes popped like strobe lights, blinding him. He saw the faces of people he had tried to impress. The mayor, the socialites, the bankers. They looked at him with a mixture of disgust and morbid curiosity, like people slowing down to look at a car crash. "Put the phone away," Arthur shouted at a former business partner who was live streaming the arrest. "Carl, put it away. I'll sue you." Carl just laughed and kept recording. "You can't sue anyone, Artie. You're finished." He was already gone to them. He was a contagion, a bad investment. As they reached the heavy bronze doors, the cool night air of New York rushed in to meet them, smelling of exhaust and freedom, things Arthur wouldn't taste for a long time. He dug his heels into the carpet. He needed one last look. He needed to understand how this had happened. He twisted his head back toward the stage. Catherine was still standing there. She hadn't moved. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't pumping her fist in victory. She was simply watching him go, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying resolution. She looked like a Greek statue of justice, finally balancing the scales after years of disarray. Dominic Rousseau leaned in and whispered something to her. She nodded, her expression softening only for him, before she turned her back on Arthur, completely. She walked toward the microphone, ready to take command of the room he had built. "I apologize for the interruption, everyone." Arthur heard her voice echo through the hall as he was shoved through the doors. "Now, shall we discuss the future of the industry?" Outside, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers bounced off the stone facade of the museum. Passers-by on Fifth Avenue stopped to watch as the billionaire in the tuxedo was manhandled into the back of a squad car. Agent Miller pushed Arthur's head down to clear the doorframe. "Watch your head." Arthur collapsed onto the hard plastic seat. The smell of the cruiser was vomit and stale tobacco. The wire mesh separated him from the front seat. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing him in a cage of glass and steel. He pressed his face against the window, watching the warm, golden glow of the gala receding as the car pulled away. He could see the silhouettes of the guests inside, returning to their drinks, returning to their laughter. The world was moving on without him. It had already filled the space he left behind. And as the siren wailed to life, cutting through the New York night, Arthur Pendleton realized the truest horror of all. The party wasn't over. It was just continuing under new management. 6 months later, the air inside the FCI Otisville Correctional Facility didn't just smell stale, it smelled like the color gray. It was a suffocating cocktail of industrial bleach, damp concrete, and the lingering sulphurous odor of overcooked cabbage that seemed to seep into the very pores of the inmates. For Arthur Pendleton, a man who had spent the last 2 decades breathing air filtered through HVAC systems scented with white tea and sandalwood, every inhalation was a physical insult. Arthur sat alone at the far end of a scarred metal table, his plastic tray vibrating slightly from the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. He always sat alone. In the intricate, brutal social ecosystem of federal prison, there was a hierarchy, and Arthur had found himself at the very bottom. He wasn't feared like the cartel enforcers, and he wasn't respected like the old-school bank robbers. He was a pariah. Even the other white-collar criminals, the tax evaders, the inside traders, the guys who fudged numbers for a bonus, looked at him with undisguised disdain. There was a code, even here. You didn't steal from the little guy. You didn't raid the pension funds of truck drivers and warehouse packers to buy diamond necklaces for a mistress. Arthur wasn't just a criminal to them. He was a rat who had eaten his own nest. He looked down at his hands. They were unrecognizable. The manicured nails were gone, replaced by jagged edges he chewed on during the long, sleepless nights. His skin, once bronzed by weekends in Saint-Tropez, was now a sickly, translucent sallow, blending in with the faded beige of his prison uniform. He had lost 20 pounds, but not in a flattering way. His skin hung loosely on his frame, making him look like a deflated balloon. The silver fox hair he had been so proud of, a mark of his distinguished executive persona, was growing out in patchy, unkempt clumps of white and dull grey. He pushed the rubbery cube of what passed for meatloaf around his tray with a flimsy plastic spoon. It was Thursday. Thursday was meatloaf. In his old life, Thursday was Oysters Rockefeller at Le Bernardin. Arthur's gaze drifted upward, drawn magnetically to the only window into the outside world allowed to them, a small, flat-screen television mounted high in the corner of the cafeteria, encased in a protective plexiglass box. It was tuned, as always during lunch, to CNBC. Usually, Arthur forced himself not to look. Watching the ticker tape of the markets he used to manipulate was a form of torture he wasn't strong enough to endure. It was like a starving man watching a banquet through a locked glass door, but today, something in the cadence of the news anchor's voice caught his ear. A name. Turnaround of the decade. Arthur looked up. The plastic spoon slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the tray. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen in bold green letters read, Holloway Kincaid Group reports, record Q2 earnings, stock up 200%. And there she was, Catherine. She was standing on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, surrounded by the chaotic bustle of traders, yet she seemed to exist in her own calm, untouchable orbit. The contrast between the woman on the screen and the memory of the wife he had discarded was violent. She looked radiant. She was wearing a cream-colored power suit, tailored to absolute perfection, that softened her authority without undermining it. Her hair, the honey-blonde waves he had seen at the gala, was styled in a loose, elegant blowout that caught the harsh studio lights and turned them into a halo. She didn't look plain. She looked like the most expensive thing in the room. Arthur leaned forward, his heart hammering a painful rhythm against his ribs. The cafeteria noise, the clatter of trays, the shouting of guards, the murmur of inmates, faded into a dull roar, leaving only the tinny audio of the television speakers. The interviewer, a young woman with sharp eyes and an eager demeanor, was leaning in toward Catherine with obvious admiration. "Ms. Holloway?" the interviewer asked, her voice breathless. "The financial world is calling this the miracle on Wall Street. When you executed the hostile takeover of Pendleton Logistics 6 months ago, the company was technically insolvent. The debt was catastrophic. Most analysts said it was a sinking ship. How did you manage to save the jobs of 4,000 employees when your predecessor couldn't?" Arthur flinched. Predecessor? He wasn't even Arthur Pendleton to them anymore. He was just a failure that came before her. On the screen, Catherine smiled. It wasn't the shy, apologetic smile she used to give him when dinner was 5 minutes late. It was a smile of iron confidence. It wasn't magic, and it certainly wasn't a miracle, Catherine said, her voice clear, grounded, and devoid of the nervous tics Arthur used to criticize. It was about a return to moral economics. We stopped hemorrhaging capital on image maintenance and started investing in infrastructure. We conducted a forensic audit of the assets. She paused, and Arthur felt the walls of the cafeteria closing in. We sold the corporate jet, she continued, listing the items like a grocery list. We sold the 3 executive penthouses in Manhattan. We liquidated the private art collection that was gathering dust in storage. We sold the vanity assets, the things that served only the ego of the executive suite, and we took every single penny of that liquid capital and put it back where it belonged, into the employee pension fund. The interviewer nodded enthusiastically. You made the workers whole. We made them partners, Catherine corrected gently. When people feel safe, when they know their future isn't being stolen to pay for a CEO's vacation, they work harder. Efficiency is up 40%. It's a simple formula, really. Respect pays dividends. Arthur felt a phantom pain in his chest. It was the crushing weight of realization. She was using his own company, the empire he built to glorify himself, to prove that everything he believed about business was wrong. And what about the rumors of a personal merger? The interviewer teased, shifting the tone. With Mr. Dominic Rousseau? The camera panned slightly to the left. Dominic was standing just outside the circle of the interview, watching Catherine. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, looking as dangerous and sleek as ever. But the look on his face wasn't the predatory glare of the butcher of Milan. It was a look of profound, unshakable respect. He wasn't her keeper. He was her consort. Catherine laughed, a sound that rang bright and true. Dominic is a brilliant partner in every sense of the word. And yes, we are very happy. But today isn't about us. It's about the company. One last question, the interviewer pressed, sensing the segment was ending. Your ex-husband, Arthur Pendleton, famously cited your plainness as the reason for your divorce. He called you furniture. Do you have any comment on that now, sitting here as the CEO of a Fortune 500 company? The cafeteria went dead silent. It felt as if every inmate in the room had stopped chewing to listen. Even the guard by the door, a burly man who usually ignored the TV, turned to watch. Arthur held his breath. His hands were trembling uncontrollably now. He waited for the anger. He waited for her to lash out, to mock him, to tell the world what a pathetic, small man he truly was. He wanted her to hate him. Hate would mean he still had power over her. Hate would mean he still existed in her world. Catherine looked directly into the camera lens. For a split second, the distance between the stock exchange floor and the prison cafeteria vanished. Arthur felt like she was looking through the screen, through the bars, and straight into the dark, empty center of his soul. I don't think about Arthur Pendleton, she said simply. The words hit him harder than a physical blow. I don't hate him, she continued, her voice level and indifferent. To hate him would require energy I prefer to spend on things that have value. He was a lesson. I learned that if you let someone treat you like furniture, they will eventually sit on you. So I decided to become the architect instead. She turned back to the interviewer with a warm, dismissive smile. Next question? The feed cut abruptly to a commercial for term life insurance. Arthur sat frozen. The plastic spoon snapped in his hand with a sharp crack, slicing into his thumb, but he didn't feel the pain. She didn't hate him. She had done something far worse. She had outgrown him. She had erased him. He wasn't a villain in her story anymore. He was a footnote, a typo she had corrected and moved past. Pendleton! The bark of the guard shattered the trance. Rec time is over. Dump your tray. Back to your cell." Arthur stood up mechanically. He walked to the waste bin and dumped his tray. The unfinished grey meatloaf slid into the trash with a wet, sickening slop, joining the rest of the garbage. He walked the long, concrete corridor back to his cell, the sound of his cheap canvas shoes shuffling against the floor echoing in the silence. He stepped inside the 6x8 cage, and the heavy metal door slid shut with a final, reverberating clang. He sat on the edge of his thin, lumpy cot and stared at the blank, concrete wall. He remembered the night in the kitchen, 2 years ago, the rain against the window, the way he had looked at her with such arrogance, convinced that he was the sun and she was just a shadow. "You're plain, Catherine. You're safe." He realized now, in the cold, crushing silence of his cage, how wrong he had been. She hadn't been plain. She had been a blank canvas. And while he was busy painting a gaudy, fragile caricature of himself, she had been quietly painting a masterpiece. He lay down and pulled the scratchy wool blanket over his head, trying to block out the prison light. But he couldn't block out the image of the sapphire star around her neck, or the way the world looked at her, with the adoration he had craved his entire life. She was the queen. He was the jester who had convinced himself he was the king. And in the end, once the laughter stops and the lights go out, the jester always sleeps alone. And that is the tragic, satisfying end of Arthur Pendleton. He learned too late that the woman he called plain was the only thing holding his life together. It's a brutal reminder. Be careful who you discard on your way to the top, because you might just meet them on your way down, and they might be the ones holding the scissors to cut your parachute. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, hard karma, and the ultimate revenge, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is massive success. And if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. We have a wild story coming up next week about a gold digger who accidentally marries a broke mechanic. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.